Hey guys, this is Justin Vandenberg, and for my public text, I decided to go with a slideshow because my topic is how did Steve Jobs save Apple? Steve Jobs was known for his keynotes, so I figured why not a better way to honor him. Then when I read over the assignment, I read that it said public keynote, public text, and I guess a keynote or a slideshow wouldn't really be that public, since the audience would probably have to be somebody coming for a specific reason to see the slideshow. So I decided to take this software, this called ScreenFlow. I paid $140 for one day, and I've never used it yet, and I figured I'll use that and post this on YouTube. And what's not more public than YouTube, right? So anyway, here I go. If I screw up or anything, this is only a draft, so I'm just going to keep going forward. And then once I do my final video for my final project, I'll make sure it's perfect, smooth, and all that. So, alright. So, here we go. How did Steve Jobs save Apple? By Justin M. Vandenberg. Just a quick little note. I chose the keynote for my project in honor of Steve Jobs. Steve was known for his keynotes, and he always used this gradient background in his presentations. Steve was known to spend a large amount of time on his keynotes, scrutinizing every little detail and studying them until he knew every single word on every single slide by heart. Steve always knew what slide was coming up next, and if there was ever any issue with his presentations, he was able to move right past it without anyone even knowing about it. The beginning of Apple. Apple was co-founded by friends Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, also known as Woz, in 1976, in the garage of Jobs' parents' home in Los Altos, California. Woz built the very first Apple I computer by hand. Meanwhile, Jobs set out to find some buyers. Wozniak was the brains, and Job was the businessman with the vision. The Apple I. In 1976, Woz sold his beloved HP 65 calculator for $500, and Jobs sold his Volkswagen van for $800 to get enough money to fund their very first computer. Woz single-handedly soldered and created the circuit board that drove the Apple I. In July of 1976, the Apple I was shown at the Homebrew Computer Club in Palo Alto, California, with a price tag of $666, which was roughly, the cost was $500 plus a third, which came out to $666.66, and Woz loved repeating numbers. This put Apple on the map. And honestly, if you were to find this computer today and were able to buy it, you'd probably pay about $100,000 for this computer, as rustic as it looks. The Apple II. The Apple II was first introduced in 1977 at the West Coast Computer Fair. It went on sale on June 10th, 1977, with a price tag of $1,298 for a model with 4 kilobytes of RAM, or $2,638 with 48 kilobytes of RAM. Now remember that a gig these days is 1,000 kilobytes. So, yeah, most computers are between 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM anymore. So just imagine how small the RAM was in those days and how much it costs. The Apple II was the first computer aimed for the consumer market at that time. It quickly became one of the most popular computers in the world and was considered the most user-friendly computer. The Apple II computer was the first computer to bring a color screen. It also came with floppy disks and had basic coding language built in. Computers of those times, users actually had to hand type out the program they wanted to use, and then they could use that program. But when the computer was shut off, all the programming was lost, and the next time they wanted to use it again, they'd have to type in all that code again to start their program. And this was like way before floppy disks. By the end of 1993, between 5 to 6 million Apple II computers had been sold, and the Apple II was successful and single-handedly carried Apple computers until the late 80s. And it looks like I got it. Okay. With so much success, Apple now worth millions, and Steve only being so young, they decided to find a seasoned leader to drive Apple in the right direction. At 24, Jobs had no interest in running the company. He wanted to create, innovate, build something special. They needed to hire a CEO. So here's the timeline of Apple CEOs. Michael Scott, 1977 to 81. Mike Markkula, 1981 to 83. John Sculley, which is important to this story, from 1983 to 93. Michael Spindler, 93 to 96. Gil Amelio, which is another important person, from 96 to 97. Jobs from 97 to 2011, when he unfortunately passed away. And Tim Cook was 2011 till today. Apple had always become so successful, and Steve Jobs was so young that they needed to hire someone to run the day-to-day operations of the company. Apple had their fair share of CEOs through the years, but the two CEOs on this list are important to know about when it comes to this Steve's departure and return to Apple. These will be John Sculley, Gil Amelio. A little history lesson on these two CEOs, just so you have an idea who they are. John Sculley from 1983 to 93. John Sculley was the CEO of Apple from 83 to 1993. Steve was so impressed by Sculley's work at PepsiCo, and on several occasions tried sweet-talking Sculley to join Apple. Ultimately, he won Sculley over with the popular phrase almost all fellow Apple nerds know about. He asked Sculley, "Do you want to sell sugar water all your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" How could Sculley say no to that? Gil Amelio from 96 to 97. This was a really bad time in Apple. Gil Amelio was hired to come and clean up Apple and try to save Apple, but unfortunately he didn't really have much time to do that. Gil Amelio was a technology executive that worked for Bell Labs, Fairchild Semiconductor, and the CEO of National Semiconductor. In 94, Gil joined the board of directors at Apple, and after his resignation from National Semiconductor, he became the CEO of Apple on February 2nd of 1996, with a salary of $990,000 a year. And I didn't add this in there, but they also gave him a $5 million loan, and they also gave him $100,000 a year to use Apple's private jet to fly around. Gil was in search of a next generation OS operating system, and ultimately bought Next from Steve for $429 million and brings Steve back to Apple as Gil's personal advisor. Now, the operating system that was in the Next computer is the same operating system that if you were to turn a Mac on today and use Mac OS X, it is built all from the Next operating system. So I think that's pretty cool. Or the foundation, anyway. 1985. Steve Jobs and Sculley are constantly butting heads. Steve's harsh and honest attitude is wearing down all of the employees. Steve and Sculley are not agreeing on much in the company. So Steve calls a meeting with his board of directors to remove John Sculley. Instead, the board chose Sculley's side and chose to strip Steve Jobs of all his power, forcing him to ultimately leave Apple. Before I started this project, I thought that Steve got fired, but actually, when I started researching, Steve actually quit. When they stripped him of his power, he really didn't have much to do around the company anymore, eventually pushed him out of there. Steve was devastated. Apple was his baby. It was a real humbling experience for Steve, but Steve did not let this keep him from doing what he loved. He ultimately started a computer company called Next Computer and buys Lucasfilm from Disney, which, that's not correct, I need to fix that. He buys Lucasfilm, rebrands it to Pixar Animation, and I believe 2006, Disney actually purchases Pixar Animations from Steve Jobs, and instantly turning Steve Jobs into a billionaire overnight. So I'm going to fix that slide. A couple fun facts about Steve Jobs. Steve did not believe in showering or deodorant. He thought all of his fruit diet would prevent him from stinking from the lack of showering. Scully made a deal with Steve, saying that he needed to shower at least once a week and be courteous to others around him. Or pretty much Steve wasn't welcome there. Steve Jobs hated wearing shoes. He always walked around barefoot and with dirty feet. There's actually stories of him in meetings putting his dirty feet up on desks in the air and kind of appalled everybody. Steve was a lifelong vegetarian. He tried all sorts of interesting diets, including fruit only, veggie only, nuts only, and a bunch of other weird things. He even believed that fruit healed his pancreatic cancer. Professionals say that if Steve would have listened to his doctors and took the medicine they wanted him to take and diet correctly, that he probably would still be here today. When the doctors told Steve what he should be eating for his diet, Steve didn't want anything to do with it. He's like, no, I'm going to do what I do. And yeah, so Steve loved to walk and talk about business. It is said that he would walk miles and miles and talk business with his guests. It's where he did his best thinking. Looks like I need to fix that slide. With Steve, either something was great or it was shit. There was no in the middle. He was known for his phrase, that shit. In his autobiography that I read, there's actually stories of him going to like 5-star restaurants in France, and he does not like the food that they're serving, and he would tell the server that their food was shit. He would get up and walk away. Walk completely out of the dinner. There's actual stories of the hotels that he was staying in that were like you could imagine 5-star hotels. And he would find something he didn't like about his hotel. He would jump on the phone with Scully, say, hey, this hotel shit, is what he would say. And they would have to go find another hotel. Steve was not a great father in the beginning. In fact, he turned his back on his first daughter, Lisa, when he was younger. He even denied that she was his. When Steve was a millionaire, he paid $385 a month for his daughter. And luckily, Jobs pulled his head out of his ass when he got older, but the damage was already done with Lisa. He was known to be a great father to his other kids later on in life. A little weird thing is after Steve built the Apple II computers and he was making another computer, he decided to make a workstation for corporate use, and he actually named that computer the Lisa, and that was the same time that he was denying his daughter. So people think that he named the computer after his daughter. Steve actually denied it, and it hasn't really been confirmed if he has or hasn't named the computer after her. Steve could be cruel to others, throw giant temper tantrums, scream and yell, but he also was well known to be a crier. He would break down in tears in front of anyone when he was upset, and just cry like a baby, they said. My favorite fun fact about Steve. Steve was known for parking and handicap parking all around the Apple headquarters. He also found a loophole in the law that would prevent him from ever having license plates on his car. In California, the law says a vehicle is exempt from displaying license plates for the first 6 months of ownership. So Steve would trade in his car every 6 months to prevent getting plates. It actually turned into a game for other employees to find Steve's Mercedes with no license plate parked in a handicap spot. This is a $155,000 car that we're talking about, and he traded for a new one every 6 months. Must be nice. Okay, now time to get back to the point of the keynote. No more fun facts. With no more Apple, Steve still needed to create and innovate. He wasn't the type to sit back and lick his wounds for too long. Along came Next and Pixar. This time of his life he was referred to as the wilderness years. It is said these are the years where Steve learned and matured the most. These were the years that turned Steve into a solid leader. He learned about relationships, delegating work to others. This is where he grew into the CEO that everybody knows. It is said that without the wilderness years, he may not have grew to be the man who would take Apple from being a month away from bankruptcy to the most valuable company in the world. Okay, so Next Computers. Next Computer was founded by Steve Jobs and was announced in October of 1988. They created the first workstation computer for education. These computers ran Unix-based OS called Next Step, which, like I said, the Next Step OS is what's actually or Mac OS 10 these days, and sold for $6,500, equivalent to $13,400 in 2017. Ultimately, Apple purchased Next for $429 million. The Mac OS 10 we use today actually originated from the Next Step OS. Pixar Animation Studios. Pixar began in 1979 as the graphics group of Lucasfilm Computers. Steve Jobs then sold Pixar to Disney in 2006 in an all-stock deal for $7.6 billion, making Steve an instant billionaire. And I believe after the deal was over, I want to say that he was worth $100 billion, but I could be wrong. I'd have to look at that. Pixar is known for tons of amazing movies like Finding Nemo, Toy Story, and The Incredibles. 1996. Apple's in financial ruins. They have tons of overstock from previous computers. Apple is dangerously close to bankruptcy. Gil Amelio has came to Apple as CEO and cuts costs, reduces Apple's workforce by 1/3, discontinues a couple projects, and oversees the development in Mac OS 8. He decides to set out and look for a next-generation operating system to drive an upcoming computer. He negotiates a deal with Steve Jobs for $429 million to purchase Next Computers and bring Steve back to Apple as Amelio's advisor. On July 4th, 1977, Steve convinced the board of directors to oust Amelio. Amelio gave his resignation less than a week later. Steve Jobs became the interim CEO on September 16th of 2007. This is a turning point in Apple history. At this time, when Steve took over, it was said that Apple was a month away from shutting down shop. If this never happened, the world may be pretty different today. And with Steve Jobs spending the last 10 years in his wilderness years, he is a man ready to take on the job. I need to swap these slides because it should be 1996 and then Disney, since that's in Pixar, because that's in 2006. The iMac changes everything. The iMac was credited for saving Apple from death. The iMac got its name from Ken Siegel, who worked at Apple's ad agency. Jobs wanted to call it the Mac Man. I am sure glad he was talked out of that. The iMac was designed by Jonathan Ives, who today is Apple's chief design officer. He has actually created every iPhone, or he has designed every iPad, every iPhone, the Apple Pencil, every computer, the Apple TV. It doesn't matter if it comes from Apple. Johnny Ives is the one that designed every last little element about it. The I in iMac stood for Internet. In those days, the Internet was just starting to make its way into computers, and Apple wanted to emphasize that the iMac was all about Internet consumption, and that it was also an easy way to get onto the Internet. The iMac also was the very first computer to feature a USB port and kill off the floppy drive. When the original iMac shipped on August 15th, 1998, it offered a 233 MHz PowerPC G3 processor, 32 megabytes of RAM, 4 gigabytes hard drive, and a 15-inch monitor, and cost around $1,299. And it came in a variety of colors: Bondi blue, lime, strawberry, blueberry, grape, tangerine, blue Dalmatian, and flower power. The iMac was so popular, it sold 800,000 computers in the first 5 months, and turns a profit for Apple for the first time in 3 years. Between the personal growth of Steve Jobs and the years that he was away from Apple and the iMac, Steve was able to save Apple. If Steve had not gone through the wilderness years, would Steve have had the knowledge to pull off the iMac? Would he have had been talked out of the horrible name of Mac Man? Would he have passed on the work to others to be able to get the computer completed in time? Would he have been able to mend relationships with Bill Gates and Microsoft for the better good of the company? I don't think so. I think that Steve took every challenge in life, ran with it, and learned a whole bunch from it. Steve was a genius. He knew how to pull out the best from the most talented people in technology. Steve may not have written a line of code or soldered a complete circuit board, but his genius was in surrounding himself with the best minds in the business and knowing what the consumers wanted from a computer company. The iMac may be what saved Apple, but it definitely was not the only hit from Apple. The iPod was big, possibly bigger than the Mac. and the iPhone is the largest brand in the world. So here's some more great products from Steve Jobs and Apple, and all of these were grand slams. 2001, Apple opens the first Apple retail store. And I really wish I had the time to tell the story. Steve actually rented a warehouse and had the very first Apple Store prototype built inside this warehouse. They spent almost a year building this store. Steve walked in and he goes, "No, there's something not right about this store." He had them tear the whole thing down from scratch, start all over, and build it again until they got it right. That's how crazy Steve Jobs was about details. He wanted everything to be perfect. From the minute that you walked into the store to the second that you left, he wanted it to be the best experience that you would ever have. 2001, Steve introduces the iPod, which was huge. 2007, Steve introduces the iPhone. We all know how big that is. 2010, Steve Jobs introduces the iPad. And then after that, Steve passes away. Another part of this too is by selling the iPad, the iPhone, and the iPod, Apple is making a bunch of money off services too, like iTunes, selling applications, selling music, selling, streaming services, all this and that. So not only is he selling a product, but he's also selling the services that fill a need to that product, which is pretty genius. So then basically, you make that one-time purchase with that iPhone, Apple's still making money from that iPhone every month by the services that you're consuming. It's actually pretty genius. Sadly, Steve Jobs passes away on October 5th, 2011, and Tim Cook steps up as CEO. Apple came out with other innovation under Tim Cook's commands, including the Apple Watch, Apple Pencil, Smart Keyboard, HomePod, and some other great products. Apple continues to innovate and come out with amazing products today because of the spirit and principles instilled by Steve Jobs. Some wonder if Apple will still make it now that Steve is gone. I think it will, as long as they never let go of the values and cultures that Steve built. I'm sure everybody's probably heard this poem, but Steve Jobs actually wrote this poem, and I never knew that he wrote this poem until I actually read it and came across it. It goes, "Here's the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can praise them, disagree with them, quote them, disbelieve them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They invent, they imagine, they heal. They explore, they create, they inspire. They push the human race forward. Maybe they have to be crazy. How else can you stare at an empty canvas and see a work of art? Or sit in silence and hear a song that has never been written? Or gaze at a red planet and see a laboratory on wheels? While some see them as crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." And stay hungry, stay foolish. Steve was really known for that phrase. And I just wrote "Thank you, Steve" on the end. I love Steve Jobs. I love Apple. I'm totally interested in them. Totally interested in the products they make. I love the products they make. I won't buy any kind of electronic unless it's Apple, because I just love what Apple stood for, what it's been through, and what it is. And I love Steve Jobs, and it was actually kind of emotional making this project because, I don't know, it's weird. It's like when you have a connection with their products, you feel like you have a connection with Steve, and it's really weird and hard to explain. And a lot of people that I talk to are Apple enthusiasts too, and they feel the same way. It's kind of a weird thing, but anyway, this is my project. This is my draft. I'm going to adjust the slides, make things better, but thanks for listening. Thanks for dealing with it. All right, bye.